The town of Harlan's Gulch had been dying for 3 years before. Mara Dusk rode back into it, and in those 3 years, it had committed to the process with the particular enthusiasm of a place that has found its true calling. The buildings along the main street had the sunken, settled look of structures that had stopped expecting maintenance and had begun the long, architectural surrender to gravity and weather. The hotel had lost 2 of its upper windows to a windstorm the previous winter and had replaced them with boards that had then warped in the summer heat, and now admitted both light and weather indiscriminately. The church at the north end had a bell, but the rope had rotted through, so the bell never rang, which the remaining residents of Harlan's Gulch had come to accept as an appropriate metaphor for their situation without anyone having to say so explicitly. The town sat in a crease between 2 long ridges in the Colorado high country, at an elevation that guaranteed 7 months of hard winter and 5 months of grudging summer. And the silver mine that had built it had played out 4 years ago, and left behind the buildings and the people who had nowhere better to go. Mara Dusk had somewhere better to go and had gone there 5 years ago, and had not looked back until looking back became unavoidable. She was 37 now, which showed in the specific way that hard years show on a face that started with good bones, not aging exactly, but a refinement, a burning away of what was unnecessary, a clarifying of the essential structure. She was dark-haired, dark-eyed, of medium height and the specific physical capability of a woman who had spent the last 5 years doing work that required it. She wore practical clothes, well-made and well-used, and a single revolver on her right hip, a Colt single, action that had belonged to her father and before him to no one, because her father had made it himself from parts, and patience in the back of his blacksmith shop when Mara was 11 years old and had given it to her at 21. With the specific formality of a man passing on the thing he valued most to the person he valued most. She carried it with the ease of something that had been part of her physical vocabulary for 16 years. She had come back because of a letter. The letter had reached her in Denver, where she had been working for the past 2 years as an investigator for a commercial law firm that specialized in mining and land claims, work that used her specific combination of skills and knowledge in ways that paid adequately and demanded enough to keep the parts of her that needed demanding occupied. The letter was from Father Delgado, the priest at Harlan's Gulch's Catholic mission, who was 71 years old and had been in the gulch since before the mine opened and had watched it go through its entire arc from hope to prosperity to decline to the current condition, and whose judgment Mara trusted more than almost any other person's living judgment, for the simple reason that he had never in her experience said anything that turned out to be wrong about what mattered. The letter said, "Mara, your father's land is being taken. Come home if you can. Come home regardless." Her father, Esteban Dusk, had been dead for 3 years. He had left her the blacksmith property and the small ranch adjoining it, 40 acres of high country, grassland with a reliable creek and the kind of soil that rewarded effort, because there was no one else to leave it to, and because it was the work of his life and he wanted it to continue as work rather than become real estate. Mara had been sending money back to keep the property maintained in her absence and had intended eventually to return and make something of it. The letter suggested that eventually had become now whether she intended it or not. She rode into Harlan's Gulch on a Tuesday in the spring of 1883, on a good black horse that she had bought in Denver with the specific requirements of durability and temperament rather than appearance, and she rode down the main street with the contained attentiveness of someone who grew up in a place and is reading what has changed against what she remembers. Most of what had changed was subtraction. People gone, businesses closed. The general texture of a community thinned by departure. What had not changed was the geography, which was as indifferent and permanent as it had ever been. The ridges above the town still carrying their pine cover. The creek still audible from the main street. The sky above still that particular Colorado, high country blue that was cleaner and deeper than sky at lower altitudes, as though the extra elevation had filtered something out of it. Father Delgado met her at the mission door. He was smaller than she remembered, which was what age did to a man who had been spare to begin with. But his eyes were the same, the specific, attentive, undeceived eyes of a man who has spent 71 years paying close attention to people and has developed a thorough and compassionate understanding of what they are capable of in both directions. He took her hands and held them for a moment and looked at her face and said, "You look like your father." It was the most specific and complete welcome he could have offered, and he knew it. Inside, over coffee that was better than anything, the difficulties, three were still holding. "Who is Crestline?" Mara said. Father Delgado put down his coffee cup. "The name on the papers is a man called Garrett Lowe," he said. "He presents himself as a development investor. He is well-dressed and well-spoken, and his papers appear to be in order." He paused. "There is a man with him who does not present himself as anything. He stays in the background. He is perhaps 45, with gray in his hair and eyes that I have only seen on two types of men in 71 years, men who have..." The three families who had refused Crestline's offers and survived the subsequent pressure campaign were, in Father Delgado's account, three very different kinds of people who had arrived at the same position by different routes and were holding it with different reserves of strength. The Aldrich family, husband, wife, and two grown sons, and had been in the Gulch for 12 years and had built their holding through sustained, methodical effort that had given it the particular durability of things, built without shortcuts. Walt Aldridge was 58, a former carpenter who had come to Colorado in the mining boom and had seen the boom's limitations early enough to put his resources into land rather than extraction. He was a large, deliberate man who had the quality of a load-bearing structure, not dramatic, not impressive in any surface way, but fundamental in a way you only fully appreciated when you considered what would happen without him. He had refused Crestline's offer on the grounds that his land was worth more than they were offering, and that no consolidation order he had seen superseded a properly registered territorial deed, which he had checked with a lawyer in Pueblo, at his own expense and at considerable inconvenience. The lawyer had agreed with him. The barn fire had happened 6 weeks later. The Reyes family was a widow named Consuela Reyes and her teenage daughter, which made them, by any reasonable assessment, the most vulnerable of the three, holding families. And they were holding with a tenacity that Father Delgado described with undisguised admiration. Consuela was 44, originally from New Mexico, who had come to the Gulch with her husband 15 years ago, and had stayed after his death because the land was hers, and leaving it would mean losing the last tangible connection to the life they had built together. She was not a physically imposing woman, and she was not a woman with resources, but she was a woman with the specific quality of someone who has already survived the worst thing that was going to happen to her, and consequently does not find subsequent threats particularly organizing. Crestline's men had visited her twice. On the second visit, she had met them on her porch with a shotgun and a quality of composure that had, according to Father Delgado, given even the quiet man a moment's pause. The third holding family was a single man, Thomas Okafor, who had come to the Gulch 6 years ago, from somewhere back east that he never specified precisely, and had built a small but productive operation on the eastern edge of the designated area. He was perhaps 50, large and quiet, with the contained, self-sufficient manner of a man who has made his peace with his own company and finds most external complications an unwelcome intrusion. He had refused Crestline's offer without discussion and had communicated, through the medium of a shotgun,
placed visibly across his doorframe during the subsequent visit by the quiet man's associates, that further discussion was not something he was inviting. Nothing had happened to his property yet, which Father Delgado thought might mean Okafor was being saved for last, or might mean the quiet man had made an assessment about the cost-benefit of pushing him. Mara listened to all three accounts and built a picture. 3 properties, 3 different situations, 3 different forms of resistance, and all 3 exhaustible by an organization with sufficient resources and patience and willingness to apply pressure. Crestline had already demonstrated all 3 qualities. The question was timing, how much longer the 3 families could hold before the pressure produced a result, and what could be done in that time that would change the mathematics of the situation. She asked Father Delgado if he would arrange meetings. He said he had already done so, anticipating the request with the preemptive thoughtfulness that characterized everything about him. The meetings were set for the following morning at the mission, all 3 families together, which was also the priest's deliberate arrangement. They have been holding separately, he said, each one alone. I thought perhaps together they might find something that alone they have been missing. Mara looked at him. You thought I would come and you prepared accordingly, she said. He looked at her with his undeceived eyes. I thought you would come, he said. Your father's daughter. Of course you would come. She was quiet for a moment, holding the weight of that. "Tell me about Garrett Lowe," she said. "What he does in the evenings, where he stays, who he talks to." Because knowing the enemy was always the first work, and the first work needed to start tonight. Garrett Lowe operated out of the Harlan's Gulch Hotel's best room, which was not saying much given the hotel's condition, but which Lowe had improved with his own furnishings brought in by wagon from Denver, a quality desk, proper lamps, a set of leather-bound ledgers that he worked from in the evenings with the systematic attention of a man who managed complexity through documentation. He was 48, well-built, with the groomed and presented appearance of a man who understood that appearance communicated authority and invested accordingly. He had a lawyer's way of speaking, precise, structured, designed to occupy the space of a conversation without necessarily illuminating it. He had been in Harlan's Gulch for 8 months, and had in that time cultivated the specific social relationships that served his operational purposes. The mayor, who was also the general store proprietor, was on Crestlin's indirect payroll through a consulting arrangement that the mayor understood and chose not to examine closely. The town's single remaining deputy, a young man named Curtis, had been given reason to believe that his continued employment in the reorganized town that Crestline intended to build was contingent on his current cooperative availability. The quiet man was named, as Mara established through a conversation with the hotel's cook, a woman named Bess, who had known Mara's father and greeted Mara's return with the specific warmth of someone who remembers who you were before you became what you are. Vic Stroud. He had come to Lowe's operation 6 months ago, origin unknown, and he occupied the functional role of security and enforcement with the professional efficiency of someone for whom this was not a new line of work. He was 47, the grey in his hair recent enough that Bess remembered when it had been dark. He ate alone, spoke to Lowe's other employees minimally, and had twice, in Bess's observation, demonstrated the specific quality of violent capability that does not need to be deployed to be communicated. He was the reason the barn fires happened, and the reason nobody talked about who had set them. What Mara did with this information on her first evening in Harlan's Gulch was walk. She walked the town with the systematic thoroughness that the Denver law firm had trained into her, and that her own instincts had been developing since long before the law. Firm, every building, every approach, every sightline and choke point, the location and apparent reliability of every person still inhabiting the place. She noted that the hotel's rear entrance opened onto a lane that connected to the livery stable and, from there, to the creek road that ran north along the ridge. She noted that Lowe's window on the 2nd floor was visible from the roof of the adjacent assay office, which was no longer in operation and therefore unoccupied. She noted that Vic Stroud's evening routine included a 30-minute perimeter walk at approximately 9 o'clock, which Bess had mentioned and which Mara verified by position. She noted the positions of Lowe's 3 other employees, functionaries rather than capable men, present for the administrative work of the acquisition operation and not for its enforcement component. She also noted something that she had not been looking for specifically, but that registered as significant when she found it. Behind the old assay office, in a narrow space between that building and the adjacent storage shed, there were boot prints in the soft earth that had been made recently, within the last day or two. Given the moisture content of the soil, the prints were from 2 different people. They had stood in that space for some time, based on the depth and clustering of the impressions. The space provided a clear view of the hotel's 2nd floor window. Someone else was watching Lowe, and had been doing so with enough care to choose a concealed position and enough patience to use it for an extended period. Mara crouched beside the prints for a moment and looked at them, and thought about what kind of person watches a man like Garrett Lowe from a concealed position in a dying mining town with the patience implied by these impressions. She thought of 2 possibilities: an ally she didn't know about, which was best case, or a complexity she didn't yet understand, which was what experience suggested was more likely. She filed it, and continued her survey of the town, and went to bed late and slept lightly with the Colt on the nightstand, and her mind running through what she had and what she needed and what morning would bring. The mission's main room held all three families on a cold spring morning with wood smoke from Father Delgado's iron stove doing its best against the high-altitude chill that persisted in the mountains well into the season that the lower country was calling summer. Walt Aldridge sat with his two sons, Carl and Pete, both in their 20s, both with their father's load-bearing quality and their own versions of his deliberateness. Consuela Reyes sat with her daughter Inez, who was 16 and had her mother's composure and the added particular fierceness of someone young enough to be angry about injustice rather than worn down by it. Thomas Okafor sat alone and slightly apart, which was his habitual position in any room, and watched the proceedings with the contained attentiveness of someone processing information rather than generating it. Mara had not planned a speech and did not give one. She sat at the table's head because Father Delgado placed her there and because it was the functional position, and she told the room directly and without preamble what she knew, what she had observed the previous evening, and what she assessed the situation to be. The assessment was not optimistic, and she did not make it so. Crestline had resources, a legal framework that appeared valid on its surface, and a man named Vic Stroud who was the reason the legal framework's deficiencies hadn't been the limiting factor in their operations to date. The three holding families had their land, their legal deeds, and their combined will, which was considerable but was not infinite, and was being systematically warned against. Walt Aldridge listened to all of this and then said, in the deliberate way he said everything, "What's your play?" Mara looked at him. She had spent the first part of the morning thinking about this question, which was the right question and deserved the honest answer she had arrived at. "The consolidation order Crestline is using," she said. "It's either legitimate or it isn't. If it's legitimate, we lose regardless of everything else. If it isn't, if it's forged or improperly issued, then everything Crestline is doing here is criminal. And the families who sold under its terms have legal recourse, and the families holding have a legal foundation to hold from." She paused. "I need to see the actual document. Not a copy, not a summary, the original filing, in the Territorial Records Office in Denver." Consuela Reyes looked at her. "Lowe showed us a copy," she said. "Certified," he said. "Certified by his own people," Mara said. "Certification is only as good as the certifying authority. The original filing is in Denver, and it either exists or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then the certification is a fraud document and everything built on it collapses." Carl Aldridge leaned forward. "How long to get to Denver and back?" 4 days minimum," Mara said. "Possibly 5. "In 4 days," Walt Aldridge said. "Lowe's people are going to increase pressure. They've been building to something." "I can feel it." Mara nodded. She had felt it too, the specific tension of an operation that has been patient and is approaching the end of its patience. "Which is why," she said, "I'm not going to Denver." She looked around the table. "Someone is going to Denver. I'm staying here." A pause. "What are you going to do here?" Inez Reyes said with the direct, unfiltered curiosity of 16. Mara looked at her and felt something that was almost like the smile she sometimes lost track of for months at a time. "I'm going to find out what Garrett Lowe's consolidation order is actually built on," she said, "and I'm going to take it apart." She looked at Thomas Okafor, who had been silent throughout. "You haven't said anything?" she said to him. He looked at her with his contained, assessing eyes. "I've been deciding whether to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "The 2 people watching Lowe's window from behind the assay office." He paused. "One of them is me." The room was quiet for a moment. Mara looked at him steadily. "And the other," she said. Okafor met her eyes. "That's what I've been deciding whether to tell you," he said. Thomas Okafor's secret had a name, Daniel Reeves, and a history that he laid out in the mission room after. Father Delgado quietly took the other families to the kitchen for coffee. That Mara understood was a deliberate creation of private space, because the priest understood people and understood that what Okafor was about to say required the specific kind of privacy that a Smaller audience provided. Daniel Reeves was a federal land agent out of the Denver office who had been conducting a covert investigation into Crestline development for 6 months, which was 2 months less than... Crestline had been operating in Harlan's Gulch, and which meant the investigation had begun before the Gulch operation, which meant the Gulch was not the origin of what was happening here, but a continuation of it. Reeves had made contact with Okafor 3 weeks ago, had identified him as a resident of the designated area who was resisting Crestline's acquisition and had assessed him as a potential source of local intelligence. The two had been meeting irregularly, in the space behind the assay office and in 2 other locations that rotated to prevent pattern establishment, and Okafor had been providing Reeves with what he observed of Lowe's operation in exchange for what Reeves was willing to share about the federal investigation, which was not much but was more than nothing. "Why didn't you tell the other families?" Mara said. Okafor looked at his hands on the table. "Reeves asked me not to," he said. "More people knowing meant more risk of Lowe finding out about the investigation before it was ready to move." He paused, and I respected the reasoning. A federal case that gets compromised before it's ready is worse than no federal case. Mara nodded slowly. The reasoning was sound, which she acknowledged even as she noted that it had left 3 families holding their positions, without knowledge that there was a federal investigation, providing a potential foundation for their legal position. "I need to meet Reeves," she said. Okafor looked at her. "He may not want to be met," he said, "by someone he doesn't know, investigating a situation he's already investigating." "He needs to know what I brought from Denver," Mara said, "and I need to know what he has. Separately, we're both working with incomplete pictures. Together you might have enough," Okafor said. He held her gaze for a moment, running his own assessment. Then he nodded. "Tonight," he said, "behind the old mill at the creek bend. 10 o'clock, he paused. "Come alone and come quiet. He'll be watching the approach, and if he sees something he doesn't like, he'll be gone before you get there." "Understood," Mara said. She stood. "Say nothing to the others about this yet." Okafor looked at her. "You sound like Reeves," he said. "Good," Mara said. "That probably means we're thinking about this the same way." Daniel Reeves was not what Mara expected, which was itself information about the shape of her expectations. She had built a picture from Okafor's account and from her general knowledge of federal land agents, and the picture had been of a certain type: institutional, procedural, operating within the frameworks his office provided. The man who materialized from the shadows at the creek bend at 10:05 was none of those things in any simple sense. He was 35, lean, with the specific watchfulness of someone who has been operating alone in a potentially hostile environment for an extended period and has calibrated his alertness accordingly. He had the look of a man who had started this work inside the institution and had been pushed gradually to its edges by the specific requirements of what the work actually demanded, and who now operated from somewhere in the productive space between official and independent. He looked at Mara for a long moment before he spoke. "Okafor vouched for you," he said. "Yes," she said. "Who vouched for Okafor?" she said. He held her gaze. "Nobody," he said. "I assessed him directly." "Same," she said. They stood beside the creek in the dark, and the creek moved past. Then, with the specific indifference of water that has its own business to attend to. "Tell me what you have," Mara said. And Reeves, after a pause that was the pause of someone deciding whether to trust what they're deciding to trust, told her.
Reeves had been investigating Crestline development for 6 months, and in those 6 months had built a case that was substantial in places and had critical gaps in others, and the gaps were the things that had kept the investigation at the covert stage, rather than the action stage. He laid it out standing beside the creek at 10 o'clock at night with the specific efficiency of someone who has organized complex information so many times that the organization has become the natural shape of the information itself. Crestline Development was a registered Denver corporation with legitimate business filings and a clean surface presentation. Its principal registered officer was Garrett Lowe, who also appeared clean on surface examination. No criminal record, established business history in Colorado land development, social and professional connections in Denver that were respectable without being powerful. But Crestline's financial flows, which Reeves had traced through 3 months of patient banking record examination, made possible by a cooperative contact in the Denver federal court clerk's office, did not run to Lowe as a principal. They ran through Lowe to an entity called Western Meridian Partners, which was registered in a different territorial jurisdiction and had no public principals listed, and which Reeves had been attempting to identify for 4 months without complete success. What he had identified was a partial picture of Western Meridian's ownership, 2 of what he believed were 3 or 4 principal investors. One was Frederick Kane, Denver financier with extensive railroad and mining interests whose name appeared in Western Meridian's formation documents under a holding company 3 levels removed, traceable only through the specific, tedious method of following corporate registrations across jurisdictions that Reeves had spent 2 months on. The second was Territorial Commissioner Harold Price, whose official role gave him authority over resource consolidation orders in Colorado and surrounding territories, which was the specific institutional position that explained how Crestline's consolidation orders managed to carry the appearance of legitimate authority. Price was issuing the orders from his official capacity, while being a financial beneficiary of the operations those orders facilitated. It was corruption at the institutional source rather than institutional capture after the fact, which made it more durable and more difficult to address. The critical gap was the consolidation orders themselves. Reeves needed the original filing documentation for the Harlan's Gulch order, specifically the document that Lowe was using to justify the acquisition campaign, to establish that it had been issued under Price's authority and cross-reference it with Price's financial connection to Western Meridian. The order's records access, a review status on a specific document, effectively removes it from ordinary examination requests without technically destroying it. But the original exists, Mara said. It has to. The order has a filing number that was issued by the records office's own tracking system before the review status was applied. The number is in Lowe's papers because he uses it to authenticate his copies. She paused. If the original is pulled from the review hold and examined, it will have Price's signature and his official seal. And Price's signature on a document that generates him financial benefit through Western Meridian is the evidentiary link, Reeves said. He was looking at her with the flat, attentive expression of someone revising their assessment upward. You're a land fraud investigator, he said. Denver law firm, she said. For 2 years. Before that, she paused. Before that, I grew up in this town and my father built the property that Lowe is trying to take. A pause. So this is personal and professional simultaneously, Reeves said. Yes, she said. Does that create a problem for you? She asked directly. He held her gaze for a moment. Not if it creates a resource, he said. My gap is the original filing. Your gap is federal authority to act on whatever we find, Mara said. Yes, he said. They looked at each other in the dark beside the creek. We need someone to get to Denver and pull that filing from the review. Hold before Price's people know someone is coming for it, Mara said. That someone needs federal authority to override the review status. Reeves reached into his coat and produced a document. A federal investigative authority credential that, he said, included records access provisions. I should go, he said. But if I leave Harlan's Gulch, Lowe's operation has no federal presence here, and the families holding their properties have 4. Original filing should be in the Territorial Records Office in Denver. Reeves had requested it through official channels 2 months ago, and had been told it was under administrative review. Administrative review was not a status that territorial records filings had in Reeves's understanding of the process, and the non-availability of the document was itself significant. Someone is keeping the original filing unavailable, Mara said. Yes, Reeves said. Price's office controls the days of unmonitored exposure to Vic Stroud. He stopped. Mara looked at him. You stay, she said. I go, he looked at her. You don't have federal authority, he said. No, she said. But I know which Pueblo lawyer verified Walt Aldridge's deed. And I know how to get from here to Denver in 3 days instead of 4. And I know what I'm looking for in the records office in a way that means I'll find it faster than someone reading the documents cold. She held out her hand for the credential. Reeves looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. Then he put the credential in her hand. 3 days, he said. If it's longer than 3 days, I don't know what condition this situation will be in when you get. She left Harlan's Gulch at 4 in the morning. which was the hour that gave her the maximum head start on the day and the maximum probability that no one connected to Crestline would be awake and observant enough to register her departure and its direction. She took the eastern road out of the gulch rather than the northern road to Denver, which was the longer route but the one that didn't pass within sight of the hotel, and she rode hard through the pre-dawn dark with the cold mountain air sharp against her face and the black horse moving beneath her with the long strided efficiency of an animal that has been well maintained and is now being asked to demonstrate the value of that maintenance. The route to Denver from the gulch went down through the foothills and then east across the high plains and then north, and in good conditions with a good horse. It was a journey of approximately 36 hours of riding time, spread across 2 days, which was the optimistic case. The pessimistic case involved weather, which was always a variable in the mountains in early spring, or road conditions, which varied with recent precipitation, or horse soundness issues, which she could not control for beyond the preparation she had already done. She planned for the optimistic case and carried contingencies for the pessimistic one, which was the only rational approach and also the approach that most often disappointed its user. The first day's riding was clean. The road down from the foothills was firm and the sky held, and by midday she was on the plains with Denver visible as a dark smudge against the northern horizon that grew as she rode toward it with the specific patience of a destination that comes to you at its own pace, regardless of how fast you're moving. She stopped twice to water and rest the horse, not because the horse demanded it, but because the horse's sustained capability over 3 days was more important than the 30 minutes the stops cost, and she ate in the saddle from the provisions she'd packed, and she thought about the records office in Denver, and what she was going to say to the clerk, and how she was going to handle the review status on the filing. The records office problem was the core tactical challenge of the Denver leg. Reeves's credential gave her authority to request access to documents under federal investigation holds, but it didn't give her authority to override a territorial administrative review, which was a different category. The distinction was the kind of jurisdictional gap that bureaucratic obstruction exploited, not a brick wall but a procedural hedge that required more time to navigate than she had. She had been thinking about it since she left the gulch and had arrived at a solution that was less elegant than she would have preferred but was available. She needed a specific kind of ally inside the Denver Territorial Records Office. Not someone she knew because she didn't know the right people in that office. Someone she could identify and approach based on what she knew about the office's internal dynamics from 2 years of working the same institutional landscape from the outside. She reached Denver at midday on the second day, which was ahead of her optimistic schedule, and was the kind of margin that didn't make you complacent but that you acknowledged as useful. She stabled the horse at a good livery and went directly to the records office without going to her old apartment or contacting her former employer, both of which would have been visible and therefore risky in ways she didn't want to invite before she had what she came professional context and who she had assessed on each of those occasions. As a person with the specific integrity of someone who had been doing honest work in a system with dishonest elements for long enough that the contrast had clarified her values rather than compromising them. She was the person Mara had been planning to approach since she was somewhere on the plains the previous afternoon. Agnes Farr looked at Mara across the desk with the recognition of someone who has a good memory for professional acquaintances, and something else moved in her expression that Mara read as a person who has been hoping for a specific kind of conversation, and is now perhaps about to have it. "Miss Dusk," Agnes said. "It's 4. The Territorial Records Office was on the 2nd floor of a government building off Larimer Street, a place she had been many times in the course of 2 years of land fraud investigations, and she walked in with the practiced ease of someone who belongs there, and went to the public access desk and asked for the senior records clerk. The senior records clerk was a woman named Agnes Farr, who had been in the position for 11 years and who Mara had interacted with on 4 previous occasions in been some time. "It has," Mara said. "I need to speak with you privately." Agnes looked at her for a moment. Then she came around the desk and led Mara to a small back office that smelled of old paper in order, and closed the door. "The Harlan's Gulch Consolidation Order," Mara said. "Filing number, CR 1882447, the review hold." Agnes sat down and folded her hands and looked at Mara with those clarified eyes. "I put that hold on myself," she said, 6 weeks ago, when someone I didn't recognize came in with Price's office credentials asking to pull the original and take it off-site for what they called internal review." She paused. Files don't leave this office for internal review. That's not a procedure that exists. She held Mara's gaze. I put the hold on to protect the document while I decided what to do about the request. A pause. I've been deciding for 6 weeks, she said. I don't think I need to decide anymore. She made the return journey in 2 days and a morning, which was faster than the outbound trip because urgency had taken on a different quality. Less the urgency of someone racing to gather what was needed and more the urgency of someone returning with what they have to the place where it is needed now. The black horse ran the plains at a sustained pace that covered ground with the efficient, ground-consuming rhythm of an animal operating at its capable best, and Mara rode with the certified documents secure inside her coat and her mind running ahead to Harlan's Gulch and what she would find there. What she found was different from what she had left. The difference was apparent from a quarter-mile out. There was smoke above. The town that was not the usual domestic smoke of cooking fires and stoves, but the heavier, darker smoke of structural burning, and it was coming from the direction of the Aldridge property on the northern edge of the designated area. She pushed the horse to a run and came into town at a speed that was not the speed of someone making an inconspicuous arrival, and she didn't care. The smoke resolved as she came through the main street, into the ruins of what had been the Aldridges' hay barn, fully involved, past saving, the volunteer effort of a bucket line, from the creek, having contained it to the barn and kept it from the house and the adjacent corral. Walt Aldridge stood, watching it burn with the expression of a man absorbing damage with the load-bearing quality she had observed in him and processing it, without visible fracture. Carl Aldridge saw her first and came to meet her as she dismounted. Last night, he said, 2 hours before dawn, same as the first one. He looked at the barn. They're accelerating. Yes, Mara said. She looked around the assembled faces, the Aldridge family. Consuela and Inez Reyes, who had come when the fire started. Thomas Okafor standing apart with his contained watchfulness. No Reeves. She looked at Okafor. He gave a small, slight movement of his head, a signal she read as later privately. She looked back at the barn. Where's Lowe, she said. Hotel, Carl said. Stroud with him. They came out to watch the fire and then went back inside. The specific audacity of it in watching the fire. They had set from a position of visible public innocence. Told her something about how confident they were in their operational protection. Not for much longer, she said. She took the documents from inside her coat and held them in her hand and looked at the burning barn and thought about her father's blacksmith shop in the creek and the 40 acres and what the documents meant for all of it. And she walked toward the hotel. She didn't go in, not yet. She went to find Reeves. Because what she was carrying required the federal component he represented, and because going into the hotel without that component was a satisfying idea that was also an operationally foolish one. Okafor found her at the creek bend at midday and told her what had happened in 3 days. Reeves had moved his observation position on the second night. Sensing increased surveillance on his original position, he had made contact with Okafor that morning and given him a message for Mara. The barn fire was Stroud's work. Confirmed by a witness Reeves had developed, the hotel's nightman, who had seen Stroud leave and return in the relevant time window and who was now in a position of considerable personal vulnerability and needed the situation resolved. Before his own nerve gave out, Reeves was at a location Okafor described and was waiting for her. She went. Reeves was in the abandoned mine's upper office building, a 2-room structure at the mine entrance that had once housed the shift supervisor's operations and now housed nothing but old furniture and the smell of decades of underground work. He had the specific appearance of a man who has been maintaining a covert field position for 3 days without reliable sleep and has converted the discomfort into alertness through the discipline of someone who has done it before and has learned what the body will and won't sustain. He looked at what Mara spread on the old supervisor's desk and he was quiet for a longer time than she expected. Not the brief quiet of someone absorbing information, but the longer quiet of someone running through what the information means for every element of the situation. They've been working. The 4th page, he said finally. The payment records embedded in the administrative notes section. Yes, Mara said. Lowe's people used the original filing as a payment record simultaneously, which means Price's copy of the filing, the one in his office, which he presumably has, also contains those notations. And Price cannot produce his copy to challenge ours without confirming the payment relationship, Reeves said. The document is simultaneously their tool and their exposure. He looked up at her. Agnes Farr's sworn statement about the unauthorized retrieval attempt is the piece that ties Price's office to the cover-up. Yes, Mara said. He tried to remove the evidence of his own fraud from the one office that held the original, using official credentials that gave him access to do it, and Agnes documented the attempt. Reeves sat back. The overall expression on his face was the expression of a case that has just become prosecutable. I need to file, he said. Today, the barn fire adds a criminal charge on top of the fraud, destruction of property, intimidation, criminal conspiracy, combined with the document evidence and my witness who saw Stroud leave before the fire. He paused. Lowe and Stroud and Price. Federal charges, all three. Mara looked at him. Filing from here, she said. Without access to your office. Without time to get to the nearest federal facility. I file by telegraph, Reeves said, to the Denver Federal Court. My credential number authorizes a telegraphed complaint that carries the force of a filed document for 48 hours, during which time I have authority to detain suspects and preserve evidence. He paused. It's an emergency provision. It's designed for exactly this kind of field situation. Mara looked at him steadily. The telegraph office, she said. Is it monitored by Lowe's people? Reeves said. Yes, the operator, a young man named Dexter, has been taking a supplemental payment from Lowe's operation since they arrived. He paused. We need the telegraph and we need Dexter to send what we give him rather than alerting Lowe. Mara thought about Dexter and what she knew about him, which was limited but included one thing that Bess, the hotel cook, had mentioned in their conversation on Mara's first evening. Dexter was 19 years old and had come to Harlan's Gulch because his uncle had offered him the telegraph position and he had taken it because he needed work and had not known what the work would eventually involve. He's young and he's scared, Mara said, and he's been in this long enough to know what he's part of. Yes, Reeves said, which either means he's committed or he's looking for a way out and hasn't found one yet. Mara thought about Agnes Farr and 6 weeks of deciding and the prepared certified copies. People who are looking for a way out, she said, generally take the door when someone shows them where it is. She picked up the documents from the desk. I'll handle Dexter, she said. You write what needs to go to Denver. The telegraph office was a small room attached to the general store, with a window that faced the main street and a door that faced the side alley. And Mara went in through the side alley door at 2 p.m, which was the time that the general store's front traffic was highest, and the side alley was consequently emptiest. Dexter was at his station, a 19-year-old with the look of someone who has been eating anxiety for 8 months and has not found it nutritious. He looked up when she came in and his hand moved toward something under the desk before. He registered that she wasn't one of Lowe's men, at which point his hand stopped and he simply looked at her with the wary, exhausted eyes of someone who is tired of being afraid of everyone, who comes through his door. Mara sat down in the chair across from his station without being invited and put the certified documents on the desk between them and said, You've been sending Lowe's communications and taking his money, and you've been trying to decide for 8 months what that makes you and what it means for what comes next. She said it without accusation, simply as a statement of what she observed. Dexter looked at the documents and then at her and said nothing. It makes you someone who made a bad decision when you needed work and has been living inside it long enough to know that it was bad, Mara said. What comes next depends on what you do today. She told him about Reeves and the federal complaint and what the telegraphed filing would mean for Lowe and Stroud and Price. And she told him what his role in the existing operation looked like from a legal standpoint and what his cooperation now would mean for how that role was characterized in what followed. She told him all of it plainly and without pressure, in the same way she told everything that needed telling. And she watched his face while she told him. What happened on Dexter's face during the telling was a version of what had happened on Agnes Farr's face, the specific expression of someone who has been waiting to be shown a door and is being shown one. He was 19 and he was scared and he had been carrying something heavy for 8 months, which was a long time to carry something heavy at 19. He looked at the certified documents for a long moment. If I send this, he said, and Lowe finds out before the marshals get here, Reeves will be in this office within 10 minutes of the sending, Mara said. With federal authority and a warrant in progress, Lowe cannot touch you with a federal agent present. She paused. And Lowe is going to be very occupied with his own situation very shortly. Dexter looked at the telegraph key. He looked at the documents. He looked at Mara. Write it out for me, he said. Exactly what to send. She put Reeves's drafted complaint on the desk in front of him. He read it once carefully with the attention of someone reading something that is going to determine a great deal. Then he put his hand on the key and began to send. The marshals were 48 hours away, which was the gap that mattered. Federal complaint filed, federal authority in play, and 48 hours of exposure between the filing and the physical arrival of men with badges and the legal wait to use them. Reeves had explained this in the mine office before they separated, and Mara had understood it as the operational reality, and had asked the relevant question, what did Vic Stroud do when cornered? Reeves had looked at her and said, I don't know. I've been watching him for 3 months and I still can't fully predict him, which is why I'm careful around him. It was the honest answer, and it was not reassuring. Stroud moved at dusk on the day of the filing. Mara was at the Reyes property when Inez came running from the road with the specific expression of someone who has seen something that required running. The quiet man, she said, catching her breath. He left the hotel with 2 others. They went north, toward the Aldridge place. Mara was moving before Inez finished. She went north on foot, cutting through the creek bed to avoid the road. And she came up on the Aldridge property from the east in the falling light and saw the 3 figures in the yard. Stroud and 2 men from Lowe's operation, and Walt Aldridge on his porch and Carl and Pete positioned on either side of the house door with the specific readiness of men who have been expecting this visit and have prepared for it. Stroud stood in the yard with the easy, unhurried quality that characterized everything he did, and that was more alarming than aggression would have been. He was speaking to Walt Aldridge, and his voice was low enough that Mara couldn't hear the words at her distance. But Walt's face told her the content, the specific, compressed expression of a man being told something that is designed to be the last word on a subject. She moved to a position behind the corral fence that gave her a clear sightline on the yard, and put her hand on the Colt and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Carl Aldridge, from his position at the house door, had seen her at the corral fence and the small shift in his posture, communicated it to Pete, and Pete communicated it to Walt with a look. And Walt's expression changed in a fraction, and something came into it that hadn't been there. Some small augmentation of the load-bearing quality. He straightened slightly. He looked at Stroud and said something that Mara caught as 3 words. We're not moving. Stroud looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked in the direction of the corral, not at Mara specifically. He was too far and the light was too low, but in the general direction, which told her that Stroud's peripheral awareness was as well developed as Reeves's assessment had suggested. He stood in the Aldridge yard in the falling dusk, and he was very still for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward town, his 2 companions following, and the quality of his walking was not the walking of someone who has accepted a defeat. It was the walking of someone who has decided to change the timeline. Mara went to the Aldridges and told them what the filing meant and what the 48 hours meant, and told them to stay together, all of them in the house tonight and tomorrow. Walt looked at her with his load-bearing eyes and said, Stroud. Not a question. He's going to move before the marshals arrive, Mara said, on what he considers the most important target. Walt looked at her steadily. That's not us, he said. No, Mara said. It's the documents. She was already turning back toward the town. She was right about the documents. She was wrong about the timing. She had thought Stroud would move after midnight, when the town was fully quiet, and he moved at 10 o'clock, which was bold in the specific way that bold moves are bold because they run contrary to what the other side is prepared for. She was at the mission, where Father Delgado had been keeping the certified copies in his office, safe at Mara's request, when she heard the bootsteps on the mission's side path, not loud, but present, and not the footsteps of someone who expected to find the building occupied. She put out the lamp and moved to the wall beside the office door and drew the Colt and waited. The mission's side door opened with the controlled quietness of someone who had checked the latch before committing to the entry, and Stroud came into the dark front room with one of his men behind him. Mara could see them by the thin moonlight through the chapel windows, 2 shapes moving with the specific, careful quality of people navigating a space they haven't fully mapped. Father Delgado was in his residence wing, which was separated from the main mission building, and Reeves, she realized in the same moment that Reeves was not in a position she knew about, which was a gap in the situation she now had to work around. She made a decision in the space of a breath. She stepped into the doorframe of the office, where the thin moonlight gave her minimal visibility, and she said, Stroud. Both men stopped. In the fractional silence that followed, Mara took the exact measure of the space and the positions and the light, and what the Colt in her hand meant against the weapons that two men represented. "The documents you're looking for aren't here anymore," she said. This was not entirely true. They were in the safe 6 feet behind her. But it was strategically useful. They were telegraphed to Denver this afternoon, along with a federal complaint that names Lowe, Price, and you. She paused. "The marshals will be here in 36 hours. What you do between now and then is the only variable left in this situation." Stroud was very still in the dark. His companion was the opposite. She could hear the specific, shallow breathing of someone whose fear response had activated. "You're Mara Dusk," Stroud said. His voice was the first time she had heard it. Low even, without inflection. "Yes," she said. "Then you know who I work for above Low," he said. "I know about Western Meridian," she said. "And Price and Kane." Something moved in Stroud's quality of stillness. "You have all of it," he said. "Yes," she said. Another silence. "Then this is already over," Stroud said. And for the first time, the quality of his stillness changed. Something going out of it. A tension or an intention releasing. He reached slowly into his coat, and Mara's grip on the Colt tightened, and he produced, not a weapon but a leather case. He held it out. She did not go to him. "Put it on the floor," she said. He crouched and placed it on the floor. "Garrett Lowe's operational files," he said. "Complete. Every property, every order, every payment to every official in 2 territories. He straightened. "I've been keeping them for 2 years, he said. "As insurance." She held his gaze in the dark. "Insurance against what?" she said. "Against exactly this," he said. "Against the day when the operation was over and the people above. Lowe decided that the people below, Lowe had become liabilities." He paused. "I've done difficult work in my life. Miss Dusk, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I'm also not going to be a loose end for Frederick Kane to manage." He looked at her steadily. "I want to talk to your federal man," he said, "about what cooperation looks like." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Wait here," and she went to find Reeves. The leather case that Vic Stroud placed on Father Delgado's mission floor contained, over the course of the next 3 hours in which Reeves and Mara worked through its contents by lamplight while Stroud sat against the wall under Okafor's watchful attention, the most complete operational record of a fraudulent land acquisition scheme that either of them had encountered in their respective professional histories. Stroud had been methodical and comprehensive in his record-keeping, which was the operational discipline of someone who had understood from the beginning that documentation was the only reliable form of security in an organization, where trust was situational and loyalty was financial. The files documented operations across 11 locations in Colorado and New Mexico, territories, not just Harlan's Gulch, but 10 prior acquisitions using the same Western Meridian infrastructure, the same price-issued consolidation orders, the same pattern of below-value offers followed by pressure campaigns. They documented payments to 14 different officials across 2 territorial governments. They documented the financial relationship between Western Meridian partners and Frederick Kane in enough detail that Reeves, working through the records with the structural comprehension of someone who had been building toward exactly this kind of documentation for months, said quietly at the 2-hour mark, "This is a RICO case. This isn't just Price and Kane. This is the largest coordinated land fraud prosecution in territorial history." He looked at Stroud. Stroud looked back at him without expression. "That's why I kept the files," Stroud said. "A man with this in hand doesn't disappear quietly." Reeves held his gaze. "What do you want?" he said. Stroud was quiet for a moment. "Prosecution," he said. "Public record. Names named. The people above Lowe answering in a federal court in front of a judge who isn't on their payroll." He paused. "And a cooperation agreement that reflects what I've provided." Reeves looked at the files. He looked at Mara. She had been thinking about the 11 prior acquisitions, the 10 communities before Harlan's Gulch that had gone through the same process and lost, the families that had sold under fraudulent authority and had been living with that loss for years. "The prior acquisitions," she said to Reeves. "The families who sold under the fraudulent orders have legal grounds for recovery under the cooperation agreement's terms," Reeves said. "If the orders are established as fraudulent, which this documentation makes straightforward, the sales made under them are voidable." He looked at her. All 11 communities. Mara sat with that for a moment. She thought about the people who had already left Harlan's Gulch. the families who had taken Lowe's below-value offers and moved on, the possibility that they could come back or be compensated, or at minimum have the record corrected. It was more than she had let herself plan for. She looked at Father Delgado, who had come in quietly at some point in the previous hour and was sitting in the corner with his hands folded and his sharp eyes taking in everything. He looked at her and gave a very small nod. "More than you came home for," the nod said, "but not more than was needed." Federal marshals arrived in Harlan's Gulch on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the filed complaint, which was within the promised window and earlier than the pessimistic estimate, and they came in sufficient number. 6 men with a supervising marshal named Briggs, who had the competent, no excess quality of someone who has been doing this work long enough to do it without theater. Mara met them at the north end of town and gave Briggs the consolidated package: certified documents from Agnes Farr, Reeves's complaint and supporting evidence, Stroud's operational files, the sworn statement from the hotel nightman who had witnessed Stroud's movement before the barn fire. Briggs looked at the package with the flat, careful attention of a professional assessing a delivery, and he said, "This is thorough work," in the specific tone of someone who is used to receiving less thorough work and is noting the departure from baseline. Garrett Lowe was arrested in his hotel room at 7 in the morning. He came out with his lawyer's composure intact and his jaw set, and his eyes doing the rapid calculation of a man who is still looking for the move that changes the arithmetic, and not finding it. He was put on a horse and flanked by 2 marshals, and he rode out of Harlan's Gulch in the morning light, without looking at the street, which was its own kind of telling. Commissioner Price was arrested in Denver that same morning by the marshals. Reeves had coordinated through his filed complaint, arrested in his office, in his official capacity, with his official seal on the desk in front of him, which was a specific kind of appropriate conclusion to a story about a man who had used his official authority as a personal financial instrument. Frederick Kane was arrested in Denver 3 days later, after the processing of Stroud's files gave the Denver federal prosecutor sufficient specific evidence to move against him. Kane's arrest produced a page 1 story in the Icon Denver newspapers that was the first public accounting of Western Meridian Partners and its operations, and the story named the 11 communities and described the scope of the acquisition scheme in terms that made it impossible for the territorial government to treat as a local matter. The subsequent federal investigation, which Reeves led from Denver with Mara's consulting involvement under a temporary appointment that the federal prosecutor put in place to regularize her contribution, ran for 18 months and produced 42 individual prosecutions and a complete legislative review of the consolidation order. Authority that Price had exploited. Vic Stroud received his cooperation agreement and testified in federal court on 4 separate occasions, and disappeared afterward into whatever life a man with his history and his documentation assembles in the aftermath. Mara did not follow his subsequent trajectory. She had enough to follow. The Dusk property, 40 acres, the creek, the blacksmith shop, was formally confirmed in her name by the federal court's order, establishing the fraudulent character of the Harlan's Gulch consolidation order. She stood in the blacksmith shop on the afternoon of the confirmation, in the smell of cold iron and old coal and the specific, particular smell of a space where her father had worked for 25 years. And she held the colt he had made, and she stood in the silence of the place and let it be what it was for a while before she decided what it was going to become. Reeves came to Harlan's Gulch 6 weeks after the marshals left, ostensibly to close out the field, investigation's final, documentation, but actually, Mara assessed, for the less official reason that he had found himself thinking about the town and a specific person in it in ways that his Denver office didn't specifically require, but that his own judgment indicated were worth following. He came in on a Tuesday evening and found her at the blacksmith shop, which she had begun to restore, the bellows replaced, the forge cleaned and operational, the tools her father had made, hanging in their original order on the wall where he had hung them. He stood in the doorway and looked at the space and said, "You're staying." It was not quite a question. "My father built this," she said, without looking up from the hinge she was working. "I'm finishing what he built." She looked up then. "Besides," she said, "someone needs to keep an eye on what happens to this town next." He looked at her for a moment. "The federal prosecutor's office has a consulting arrangement that doesn't require Denver residency," he said, "for the right investigator." She held his gaze. "Is that an offer?" she said. "It can be," he said. She looked at the hinge in her hand, and then at the shop, and then at the spring light, coming through the repaired window. And she thought about her father and the colt and the creek and the 40 acres and what comes after the long work is done, and the answer turns out to be more work. Different work, worth doing. Ask me again in a month, she said. When the forge is running. He looked at the forge and the shop and her. A month, he said. And he stayed for the evening and helped her with the bellows, because a man who has been doing solitary fieldwork for months does not always need to be asked twice to be useful, and because the work was there, and the hands were available and the evening light through the repaired window was the particular, clean gold of high country spring, and some moments are exactly what they are and don't need anything added to them.